Thank you all for coming. I'm David Henry, Chair of the Communication Studies Department. I have the honor today of introducing our guest speaker first. I've been instructed by Dr. Thompson, which is what I always do, get instructed by the faculty, and then they're happy, sometimes. To be sure to acknowledge the Campus Engagement Committee, which I do. The Campus Engagement Committee has been hard at work for months preparing for the presidential debate that will take place here on October 19th, and included in that preparation is the 5-speaker series of which today's lecture is a part. That was made possible by Senior Vice Provost Carl Reiber, who was instrumental in making all of this happen. He also made the mistake of mentioning at a meeting, he uttered the words, "I have money." And he didn't know that everybody in the room knew how to spend money. So he doesn't have any more money, but we got some of it to bring Dr. Hinck here today. I also was instructed by Dr. Thompson to instruct you. So it trickled down. If you have questions, if questions occur to you as the debate progresses, please write them down. You should have been provided a card and a pencil for writing down the questions. And once you have a question written down, if you want to pass it along, if you'll raise your hand, there are volunteers wandering around, and they're easy to catch. They're wearing coated black t-shirts that say volunteer, so you can catch them. And once the presentation is over, Dr. Thompson will take over, and he will be the one that reads the select questions that you may have submitted as we progressed. Our third guest scholar is Dr. Edward Hinck, professor and interim chair of communication and dramatic arts at Central Michigan University. A graduate of the University of Utah, he earned his master's at Wichita State and his PhD at the University of Kansas. Professor Hinck published his first book, Enacting the Presidency, Political Argument, Presidential Debates, and Presidential Character in 1993. He has since become a leading scholar of political communication generally and of political debates in particular. In addition to a second book, Dr. Hinck is the author or co-author of 30 or more refereed journal articles and book chapters, as well as 60 conference papers and public presentations. His research has appeared in such scholarly outlets as Argumentation and Advocacy, and his work on argumentation has earned both a national and international reputation. His most recent essay, Debate Activities and the Promise of Citizenships, is due shortly in a collection called Debate and Citizenship, edited by J. Michael Hogan of Penn State University, forthcoming in Penn State Press's series on deliberation and democracy. Dr. Hinck's path to presidential debates is a logical one, given his career in intercollegiate forensics. He served as CMU's forensics director for 25 years, during which time he also taught social influence, rhetorical criticism, leadership, communication, social change, communication theory, and he cleaned out the floors when the janitor didn't have time. He's a jack of all trades. Beyond the classroom, this part's impressive. At least I'm impressed, which means you need to be impressed. Beyond the classroom, his teaching includes a strong commitment to and success in individual instruction. He has directed 24 master's theses at Central Michigan, 3 of which have won the university's award as top master's thesis. That's a career all in one enterprise. Ed has served as guest editor of Argumentation and Advocacy on the editorial boards of that journal as well as the Forensic, edited the National Forensic Journal, and reviewed journal manuscripts and submissions to regional and national conferences for over 20 years. Dr. Hinck's second book, Politeness in Presidential Debates, Shaping Political Face in Campaign Debates 1960 to 2004, appeared in 2009. 7 years later, to talk of politeness and presidential debates in the same sentence seems oxymoronic. Yet that is indeed the task that Dr. Hinck has engaged for today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Hinck.
Thank you for those very, very kind words. I just want to say thank you to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. It's been super friendly to be here. I want to say thank you to Dr. Jake Tompkins and Dr. David Henry. They invited me into their classroom today. I had a great time talking with the students. I'm very, very happy to be here today to talk about politeness and presidential debates. I also want to say that the research that I'm talking about here today is part of a collaboration between myself, my darling wife, Shelley Hinck, and my good friend and colleague, William O'Daly, who is the real chair of the Department of Communication and Dramatic Arts. I'm just serving as the interim chair for a semester, thank goodness. Today, I want to divide my presentation into three basic parts. I want to begin by talking about the theory and the concepts that we're taking from a general communication of politeness and applying to the study of presidential debates. The second thing that I want to do is talk about how we go about gathering the data, what constitutes the data for our research. And then the third thing I want to do is talk about the results and review some of the studies we've done up to this point in time. And I want to lead you up to a set of results that I think are potentially problematic for our nation. And that's the problem of political polarization. So let me turn now back to the theory and concepts that we're using in the study of presidential debate. We are taking a general theory of communication called Politeness Theory that came out in a book authored by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson in 1987. In this book, they argued that social image, a person's face, is a universal concern across cultures. They distinguish between two types of face, something they call positive face, which is the desire for someone to be approved by others, to be liked by others, and negative face, which is the desire to be free from imposition. So any kind of interaction with other individuals can bring face into some sort of risk. So if you said to someone you're having dinner with, pass the salt, that can be heard or read as a command. If, however, you say, please pass the salt, that can be read or interpreted as a request. Both sentences ask for salt, but they're very different in terms of the relationship that they structure between the individuals who are speaking. And that's the issue that Brown and Levinson were interested in exploring in their research. Brown and Levinson were interested in figuring out how human beings use language to manage potential aggression between interactants. And this gets at notions of respecting the other person, showing consideration for their thoughts, their feelings, showing considerations for civility. These are all the kinds of things that are wrapped up in their approach to the study of communication. Now, in passing, in the book, back in 1987, Brown and Levinson say that we need more research on political contexts. How do face threats work when others observe social face being placed at risk? And that leads us to consider how politeness works in presidential debates. If you think about it, the point of a debate is for a candidate to try and win the favor of the audience, to get the audience to approve of their ideas, their values, their programs, their interests, the things they're trying to do for the country. And so this is an example of positive face. The candidates want your support when they argue. They want to create doubt about the opponent. They want to undermine the degree to which their opponent might be perceived as favorable on the part of the audience. And so positive face is that whole exchange over arguments in the debate that leads one to believe that one candidate is going to be a better leader than the other candidate. Negative face can also be placed at stake in debates. Negative face, recall, is when one possible candidate interrupts another candidate's attempt to speak, takes away their turn, tries to demonstrate some kind of social dominance in the debate. It's an attempt to impose upon the other person's freedom, the other candidate's freedom to speak, to make their ideas present in the debate as well. Now, negative face threats can occur in debates. They happen when format begins to break down, or when the moderators can't enforce the format, or when the moderators begin to lose control over the candidates because they're competing so strongly in the debates. They can also occur in dramatic moments where candidates might step out of the format to engage in some sort of a face threat that attempts to control the other candidates. In this program of research that I'm talking about today, our argument is that, for the most part, positive face is placed at risk in the debates. That's because you've got a format that generally protects from interruptions, although they do occur, and partly because you want to make sure that both candidates have a chance to speak, and the idea is that interruptions diminishes those kinds of opportunities, and the moderator is there to try and ensure some kind of order. So while negative face can be important and can be dramatic moments where the images are being formed in a debate, our argument is they aren't as important to the question of positive face, especially when it comes to talking about policies, programs, and character. But that's not to say that negative face is irrelevant in the debates. Studying politeness in debates helps us to understand how the qualities of leadership might be demonstrated on the part of the candidates in this highly dramatic, high-stakes event called a presidential debate. We watch how the candidates manage these face threats against their image, against their candidacy, and we begin to think about how they might function as a leader. So how face threat relates to campaign outcomes becomes an important question. How well candidates manage face threats becomes an important issue. And how well our democracy is doing becomes, I think, evident by how we watch these debates. And we begin to take stock of how well the candidates manage these threatening moments to their images in the debates. So now I want to have a small interlude here and give a short story about how the research got started. So many years ago, right after the 1992 presidential campaign, my wife and I were having an argument about what was more important in the debates. Being trained as a debate scholar, I said it's about the arguments and the content. And being trained as an interpersonal scholar, my wife argued it's about the relationship that's built between the candidates and the debate, or what's displayed in terms of respect between the candidates. After a few iterations of arguing, we realized that neither of us had any evidence to support our claims. And so it occurred to us, perhaps we should do a study. And that's sort of the launch, the initiation of this research project that I'll be talking about today. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we apply politeness to the debates. Basically what we do is we take a coding schema, we take the transcripts of the debates, we work through the transcripts, and we make three kinds of decisions in the coding of the debates. The first decision we make is to divide the transcript up into what are called thought units. This is a basically abstract concept. Basically, the content determines where the unit starts and stops, and that's when another thought, a shift in subject matter might occur. We'll put a bracket around that. We call that a thought unit. The subject matter remains basically the same, and that's what we focus on when we look for face threats in the debate. The second thing we do is we look for instances of face threat that deal with the following kinds of categories. So one thing that we look at is face threats that deal with character and leadership. A second thing we look at is policies and proposals. Third, we look at face threats dealing with how the candidates use data in the course of arguing about the issues. We also look at how the candidates assert or imply responsibility for problems. We've looked at disagreement with one's opponent. We've looked at appropriateness of campaign tactics. And the last category is ridicule, which up to this point in time, we have not seen very many incidents of in the transcripts that we've coded from 1960 to 2004. We also code for levels of face threat, and it's at this point that I need to turn to the PowerPoint to try and talk about how levels of face threat are coded in the study of the debates. Before I even begin to use PowerPoint, I want you all to know that I just turned 60 on August 27th, and the use of technology is very intimidating to me. So please bear with me if I fail to use PowerPoint appropriately. So our coding schema looks for three kinds of statements. One kind of a statement we look at threatens the positive face of the candidates. A second kind of a statement is to look at statements that balance threatening and supportive messages. It can be the case that a candidate would say one thing that's nice to their opponent and then say one thing that's threatening or mean or critical to their opponent. And then a third thing we look for in the debates are messages that are supportive of the opposing candidate. And we've not found as many of those kinds of statements as one might hope. And that makes sense because it's a debate. The candidates are competing. It's a forum designed to engender disagreement. But once in a while, supportive comments are found in the debates. Now let me add a little more detail to the coding schema. There are 5 levels. The first level is what's called a direct face threat. And to give you an example, this excerpt comes from John Kerry way back in 2004. He said, "This president has made a colossal error of judgment, and judgments are what we look for in the President of the United States of America." Now, think about the threat to the opposing candidate's face when you say something like that. It's highly critical. Now, we can compare this with what we call a level 2 face threat, which is an indirect face threat. So if I could be so bold as to, very good. Level 2 is an indirect face threat. We've got this example from John Kennedy back in 1960. He says, thirdly, in 1952, there were only 7 votes in favor of the admission of Red China into the United Nations. Last year, there were 29, and tomorrow, when the preliminary vote is held, you will see a strengthening of that position or very closely to it. We have not maintained our position and our prestige. Now, in that statement, he's being critical of the opposing administration, but he doesn't name his opposing candidate or the incumbent president. As a result, we code this as an indirect face threat. The audience could read this as maintaining some degree of respect for the opposing administration. Make some sense? Third level. This balances both threatening and supportive evaluative implications for the other's face. This is an example from Ronald Reagan in 1980. I have not had the experience the president has had in holding that office, but I think in being governor of California, the most populous state in the Union, if it was a nation, it would be the 7th ranking economic power in the world. I too had some lonely moments and decisions to make, but I know that the economic program that I have proposed for this nation in the next few years can resolve many of the problems that trouble us today. So in this excerpt, we see him giving a nod to his opponent, but also claiming for himself that he would be a capable president for the United States. And in this kind of a statement, we see a balancing between the concern for one's image and the other person's image as well. Level 4 supports the positive face of the candidates. And so we have this statement from Barack Obama in 2012. He says, I suspect that on Social Security, we've got a somewhat similar position. Social Security is structurally sound. It's going to have to be tweaked the way it was by Ronald Reagan and the speaker, Democratic Speaker Tim O'Neill, but the basic structure is sound. So in this message, Barack Obama is supporting his candidate. There's some agreement there. He's respecting the other candidate as not being completely wrong on this issue. We go to level 5, and this is explicit support for the positive face of the candidate. This comes from John F. Kennedy, 1960. He says that I think that Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States? Now notice the use of the term effective. That can be read as a compliment on the part of John F. Kennedy to his opponent in that debate, Richard M. Nixon. And so that's an example of a message that explicitly supports the positive face of the opposing candidate. With that in mind, I'd like to talk about some of the findings that we've had in applying this research program to the debates. And I want to start with the first study we did back in 1992. So hopefully by this point in time, you've got an idea of the theory and the concepts that we use in this research program. Second, you've got an idea of the coding scheme, how we go about making sense of these debates in terms of politeness theory and concepts. And now I want to talk a little bit about some of the research findings that we've been coming up with since the study of the 1992 debates. So way back in 1992, after my wife and I were having this argument, we decided that we needed to do some research. We needed to actually look at the transcripts from the 1992 debates and see if there were any real differences between the candidates in terms of these things called face threats. Because for all we know, we could have been making this up. It'd be simply a product of our imagination. So what we did is we coded the transcripts from the 1992 presidential and vice presidential debates. And what we found were that there were significant differences between the candidates. And one of the more interesting findings is that Ross Perot was actually the most polite of the three candidates in those debates. And we kind of make the argument in the paper that we published way back in 2002 about these debates, is that might have explained his continuing appeal at about 10% of the American public, even after it became clear that there wasn't going to be a major shift, but he still had a 10% of the American public that stayed with him for the duration of that campaign. So in thinking about this finding, we thought that this study by itself doesn't really tell us much other than that maybe there are some differences when you look at the text or the transcripts of the debates. So after that, we decided to see if audience members were actually making use of these things called politeness constructs when they sat and watched the debates. So we put together a survey instrument and we held debate watches in the 2000 campaign, 2004 campaign. And the survey instrument basically compared advocacy skills with politeness skills. So in the survey instrument, we asked individuals that came to the debate in a pre-test, what's more important to you, or what are the kinds of things that are important to you? Advocacy skills was one set, and so we had basic traditional questions about making claims, using evidence, reasoning, and we compared that with some questions about politeness skills, which might be considering the other person's ideas, respecting the other person's ideas, acknowledging the other person has ideas. And in the course of doing the analysis of the data from these two campaigns, we found that advocacy skills played the most important role in audience members making their evaluations of the candidates. So in a sense, that's good news. But politeness also played an independent and partial role in evaluating the candidates. And so in that sense, we thought there was something there in terms of exploring further with respect to this idea of how the candidates treat each other in the debates as being important or not. From looking at how audiences make sense of the debates, we turned back to a study of the transcripts of the debates. We thought it would be interesting to look at the debates from 1960 to 2004. And so what we did is we coded all of the presidential and vice presidential debates from 1960 to 2004. Here are some of the findings. One of the findings was that challengers were more successful when they used indirect messages. And we also found that incumbent presidents had more leeway in being face-threatening, in being able to use more direct face-threatening messages. And we thought that there may be something of an advantage there in terms of being in the office. There's some kind of institutional ethos that the president has to defend. But it also means that for incumbents, if they want to win, or for challengers, if they want to win, it doesn't make sense to be aggressive with direct face threats. It's more important to think of indirect face threat strategies. That's the thing that we found will get them closer to winning. At least there was a correlation between indirect face threats and winning. Not a causation, for those of you who are well-trained social scientists in our audience, not a causation, but a correlation. There were also two trends that were somewhat disturbing at the end of completing the book that came out in 2008. One of the trends was that indirect messages were declining in number. We saw a trend starting from 1960 going through 2004. Another trend was that direct face threats, that is what would be characterized as more aggressive messages, the trend was increasing from 1960 to 2004. In 2008, we looked at the problem of direct attacks in the 2008 debates. And one of the things that we found is in the third debate, when the candidates were given a chance to transcend this so-called aggressive attacks between each other on the issue of campaign tactics, both candidates fell into a pattern of repeated charge and countercharge over campaign tactics, such that it was very difficult for them to remove themselves from repeated charges about who was more ethical or less ethical in the debates. In 2012, we compared the US debates with British leader debates and the very first Egyptian debate. We found that the US and British debates were similar in terms of some of the face threat patterns, but in the Egyptian debate, it was very interesting. It was difficult to engage in arguments about the role of religion in government. And so that says to us that there may be some important cultural differences in how these ideas of politeness and face threats take place across cultures. We also found that our coding schema might need some work to account for cultural differences. On our research team, we had an individual who was Egyptian in terms of her heritage, and she was able to translate some of the things that we coded as a face threat about using information. She said that's not really about the reliable use of data in this debate event. This is about calling the other person crazy. So that really should have been counted or coded as a ridicule, as an insult, but we kind of missed that in terms of our coding scheme. So if we want to do some more intercultural kinds of comparisons, we're going to have to take a look at that. Now, one of the things we're trying to do now is to integrate the results of coding the debates from 2008 and 2012 with the data from 1960 and 2004. And so we took the results from 2008 and 2012. We've integrated them with the data from 1960 to 2004, and this is what we found in the results. Our data point starting here is 1960. And as you can see, the percentage of indirect face threats over time was pretty good, at least through 1976 and 1980. Look how high those data points are. In other words, criticizing your opponent in an indirect way that preserved to some degree their face was quite evident in those first three campaign debates. And what we see here is a continual decline all the way through 2012, although 2004 is sort of our trough. This represents, I think, a problematic trend in American political discourse. I'll let you think about that for just a moment. The question to ask is there a corresponding increase in direct face threats? The picture might be a little bit murky when we turn to the next slide. When we look at percentage of direct face threats over time, it varies. And so the question becomes, is there really a pattern here in terms of the use of direct face threats over time? I do want to point out, and I'll come back to this in just a second, that in 2004, that's the peak of what we're seeing in terms of direct face threats in time. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but I'll be mentioning, as I kind of close my discussion here, that that represents the point in time when Bill Bishop, in a book he calls The Big Sort, 2004, he argues, was the first presidential election that can be accounted for with the big sort. And when I read that and recognized that that was the spike in really, really significant direct face threats over time, I thought that was very interesting. Now, I want to remind you for just a second of one of the stages of the coding we did in the course of gathering the data for the debates. So one of the things that we do is we try to identify the thought units in the transcript of the debate. The thought units kind of give us the beginning and the ending of where the face threat action might be occurring, right? Remember that? You draw a boundary over the subject matter, where it starts, where it ends, and another subject matter gets taken up. When we shift the analysis to thought units, this story changes a little bit. And so now let me go to the next slide. When we look at the percentage of face threat thought units spent directly attacking character and leadership competence, this is the trend we have going all the way up to 2008 and a significant spike in 2012. Now, this is just one of the 5 or 6 dimensions that I'd mentioned earlier. We can also code direct face threats on use of information, campaign tactics, those kinds of things. But this is a direct face threat on character and leadership competence. And so what we think is happening is that the focus of the debate is narrowing more to that dimension, or more so than some of the issues. So you don't get as many comments about the use of data to support claims about whose policy might be better in the debate. You don't get direct face threats or indirect face threats comparing the quality of the programs that each candidate is talking about. What you're getting are direct face threats on character and leadership competence. And so we think this may be potentially problematic for our American electorate. The next question is asked is why are we seeing these trends in political debates? And so the first explanation I've already kind of hinted at and disclosed, and that is the problem of political polarization. You may or may not have read in some of your political science classes that Robert Putnam has written about the decline of social clubs after World War II, that Americans don't spend time socializing with each other, with individuals that have different political viewpoints, different political values, and as a result, they just don't spend time getting to know other individuals in their community. The book that I mentioned before by Bill Bishop, The Big Sort, that came out in 2009, recall that he argued that the first presidential debate can be explained by the Big Sort. And he notes that Americans now try to segregate themselves into communities of similar and like-minded individuals. And your own cameraman offered another explanation. Matt, where are you, Matt? Something I'm completely unaware of. He said, by the way, did you know that Facebook started in 2004? And I said, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And all of a sudden the light went off in my head. I'm not on Facebook. I don't do social media, mainly because I don't know how. As I've tried to explain, I just turned 60 years of age, and so this is a realm of interaction that I'm not as familiar with. But if you think about it, the advent of social media from 2004 and on reinforces the idea that you can communicate with people that share the same opinion that you do, that online communities can segregate so that they don't have to engage in discourse with communities that disagree with them, and as a result, that becomes a second possible explanation. A third possible explanation for these trends can be found in the formats and the moderators. If you go back and look at the 1960 debates, there were pretty clear formats there, even in the 1976 debates and 1980 debates. And with the format, you've got rules that govern when individuals can speak and for how long. The different debate camps agree to these rules ahead of time. The idea is that if they're just going over time a few seconds, the moderator can say, I'm sorry, you're over time, and then that discourse stops, and the next candidate gets a chance to speak. So there are fewer instances of interruptions. As debate formats have changed, as moderators have been called upon to play a greater role in maintaining order in the debate, you're seeing more interruptions, and as well, moderators are called upon to ask difficult questions. If you're a journalist, you know that part of your job is to ask questions that make the inconvenient facts of a politician's career or public record, or even sometimes their personal life, part of the public conversation. And so that means that moderators are called upon to ask face-threatening questions to get that conversation started. And for the first time, in an article that came out in 2012, edited by Mitchell McKinney, who was here earlier, one of the studies we've done is looking at the face-threatening comments of the moderators. And what we found is that the moderators tend to contribute to the highly aggressive level, at least in the GOP debates of 2012, because they asked such face-threatening questions. On the other hand, that's part of their job. And so it becomes incumbent upon the political candidates to figure out how to answer those questions in ways that don't necessarily contribute to a higher level of intensity in the debate. So the formats have evolved to the extent where there's more flexibility for them to let the candidates speak a little bit longer. Their job is not only to ask questions, but give the candidates a chance to speak. That can cause the candidates to compete over the turns to talk. That can cause the candidates to interrupt each other, and I think we've been seeing more and more of that in the debates. So the moderators have a really tough task. And I don't know if you've been following the recent interview conducted by Matt Lauer in the Presidential Debate Forum, the Presidential Leaders Forum. He was criticized heavily for not being even-handed in the way he treated the candidates. And so it could be the case that in the wake of that criticism, even the moderators for our upcoming presidential debates will be thinking hard about how to ask questions that push the candidates. And so the difficult job they have is to both push the candidates while also not pushing the candidates so hard that it becomes a direct face threat to start that debate off, because that tends to pitch the debate at a pretty high level of aggression. Because a candidate just can't simply say, yes, all those criticisms of what you've just made of me are right. I mean, that doesn't really get the debate going in an interesting way. The candidate can't concede all of those problems. They've got to find ways to address the concerns of interest to the moderators and the audience and the public. So hopefully the moderators will struggle to do a good job. The upcoming debates will be interesting to watch. It'll be interesting to see how the candidates adjust their strategies from the primary debates, where they're competing with a group of candidates and the audience is somewhat narrow because it tends to be a partisan audience, to what happens when they have to talk to a general audience in a general campaign debate. It'll be interesting to watch how the candidates respond to the moderators. It will be interesting to watch how the candidates respond to the strategies and tactics their opponents have planned for them. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this particular presidential campaign, I think for all the reasons that you know. I want to close by telling you a little bit about what we're doing now in terms of a research program. We're coding the primary debates from the 2016 campaign on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, and we're hoping to see if there's a difference in the way in which the parties go about their work of arguing about who should be the leaders of their parties. We're also conducting a debate watch over the campaign debates that are occurring the next couple of weeks here to see if audience members are still using politeness constructs to make sense of the candidates' discourse in the debates. And we want to see, depending upon how these debates turn out and how this campaign turns out, if politeness still plays a significant role, whether in terms of being very aggressive or being more indirect and face-saving in the election outcome, or at least in the decisions or the evaluations that the respondents, the participants make when they watch the debates. And then last, we want to see how the politeness scores from the 2016 presidential debates compare with those from 1960 to 2012, because I think that will give us the most up-to-date understanding of this issue of politeness in presidential debates. So that's what I have to present to you today. Thank you for inviting me. I've had a wonderful time here, and I think there's time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hinck. Very much enjoyed that. I appreciate you being here. Can we have another round of applause for Dr. Hinck? You did such an awesome job. It's a very interesting topic. We appreciate you being here earlier today as well in the class. Before I begin with the questions here, I do want to say a couple things. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors again, to thank UNLV Libraries for supporting the videotaping of this lecture series. I'd like to thank the Dean of the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs for supporting the space and the Campus Engagement Committee. I also want to thank all of you for being here today and participating in our democratic process and being engaged. I think it's really important, and this is like some of the most fascinating stuff ever to figure out, like how communication theories operate and become operationalized in political discourse. And so maybe it's just because I'm a geek, but I think it's really, really fascinating personally. So Dr. Hinck, thank you again for being here. We have some great questions from the audience. The first one that I'm going to ask here is this. So, since the studies examine face, with quotation marks around it here, have you studied audio-visual images as well as textual data, not just candidate statements, but rather politeness in terms of appearance, perhaps?
No. And if you're a graduate student and ask that question, that would make a great master's thesis or doctoral dissertation. No, the answer is no. I'm very interested in the nonverbals in the debates. I've made a verbal commitment to another book project looking at nonverbal communication in the debates, which I've done no work on, and to my potential or prospective co-authors, since this is being videotaped, please let them know my apologies. No, I think it's a fascinating area, and it deserves a lot of attention. There was one moment in the, I can't remember which Democratic primary debate, but there was one moment when Bernie Sanders turned to Hillary Clinton and gave her a hug. And I think that was an unprecedented moment in the history of American political debate study, because I've never seen that happen. That's an example of, if you could define the perfect example of a supportive communication behavior. I think a hug is like the definition of supportive communication, right? That was a significant moment to actually see that happen while they're competing for the Democratic nomination. So the answer is no, I haven't studied that, but yes, it's a very important question, and maybe someday I'll get to it.
We'll get some young scholars to work on that right away here. Okay, the second question I think is one that's been on a lot of people's minds, especially when they heard that your lecture was going to be on politeness. You could probably guess what it will be. The Trump and Clinton campaigns have sometimes been described as breaking all of the rules of modern politics, or I've said to my classes, the things that we thought that we knew about politics are maybe no longer true. We'll have to go back to the drawing board. So are you willing to predict that your previous findings might apply to the 2016 debates?
I know, I don't want to predict. No, that's why I'm so excited about this debate. Because if you see really aggressive messages in this debate, and the person who uses the more aggressive messages wins, that's going to cause a lot of problems for some of the claims that I've already made here. If you see really face supportive messages, what I would describe as indirect messages, and that's the candidate that wins, either side. Remember, either candidate can adjust from the primary debate strategies he might have used to the general election campaign strategies. So if a person was very aggressive in the primary debates, they could come out in a more using a more conciliatory tone, a more face supportive tone, or a less face threatening tone. So anything can happen, right? Anything can happen. That's the thing that's interesting about the general election debates. And that's why it's so important for us to kind of get the coding done and the research done, is because I'm just not sure. Principally because up to this point in time, a lot of what we thought we knew about political communication debates doesn't seem to apply. So I don't know. I'm not willing to predict.
Not willing to
Yes,
predict.
I want to research this more.
If you were a Vegas odds maker,
Oh my gosh. Oh my
just
gosh.
in case any of us are betting on this, what do you?
My heart tells me to go with the candidate that can find the more face-supportive way of arguing about differences in American politics. That's what my heart tells me. I also want to say that's what my mind tells me, that I think that the candidate that will prevail will find ways to talk about political differences in ways that allow us to respect both candidates and in ways that will respect the way our leaders go about solving political problems. I just have to believe in that. I have to believe that the American public will respond to that sense of respect and the need to work through political differences. I don't think I chose a candidate there.
No.
That's a really good question.
I want to ask a follow-up about that as well, which is, apologize because it's not written down on the card here, but how does that relate to expectations about presidential debate performance? So like, let's say I'm a presidential candidate and I'm a really mean person and you're a presidential candidate and you're a really nice person. If I come off as like, I'm kind of nice maybe in the debate, does that can you factor expectations about politeness into your studies, or have you? How do expectations play into your studies?
We haven't researched that in terms of expectation, like calculating expectations for behavior before the debate, which I think is an interesting question. I mean, there's a whole body of literature out there on expectancy violations, and I think it's done in the relationship to interpersonal communication context. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to give you a really good answer to that question. But when a viewer who hasn't paid much attention to the primary campaign tunes into the debates, and if they're an undecided individual and they're watching the two candidates argue, and they may have heard things about one candidate going into the debate, and they have the expectation that that candidate might be mean, and then find out that that candidate seemed really nice, they might say, I don't see any problem with voting with this candidate. And actually, there is one example historically in the Reagan-Carter debate in 1980. A lot of the individuals thought that Ronald Reagan was too extreme, too warlike, was a warmonger, was too much of a hawk. And so they thought that Jimmy Carter would reveal that, take the mask of a nice person off Ronald Reagan's face and show him to be a kind of a mean person who was ready to go to war. And that didn't happen. That's actually some of the research that I started way back when I was in graduate school. The first paper I did, I went into that project thinking I'm going to write about how Jimmy Carter should have won that debate. And as I kind of mapped out the arguments as they were developing in the campaign, I realized that when Jimmy Carter made a criticism of Ronald Reagan would refute it. Jimmy Carter would not rebuild his argument. Then I saw Ronald Reagan make 5 arguments, I think, against Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter just didn't answer those arguments. So at the end of that, I was saying to myself, well, that makes some sense. Ronald Reagan answers arguments in this debate, seems reasonable, and all of a sudden I began to understand why a lot of individuals in a close campaign, after watching that debate, thought it would be okay to vote for Ronald Reagan, despite what they might have heard from the opposing campaign. So I think in some instances, you can have a sense of what you've heard about a candidate coming into the debates. But the debates do a very good job of slowing down movement in the polls because individuals who tune in to watch the debates, they get a lot of information from watching the debates. Not just about the candidate's policies and proposals, but they get information about how the candidate handles him or herself in relation to the other candidate. Again, that's that notion of politeness. How do they get along with people who differ in terms of their beliefs and values from them? And so it may be the case that after watching the debates, if you've got some doubts, especially if you're an undecided voter, you take a step back and say, well, my doubts about this candidate are now resolved, and I can vote one way or the other. So that's possible.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, here's another question. So challenger candidates, you've said that challenger candidates are likely to be more successful when they use indirect face threats, and incumbents are more likely to get away with direct face threats. If neither candidate is an incumbent, what is the most likely outcome?
Again,
historically,
yes.
Historically.
That I'm not sure. I don't think our data answers that question. But if I had to make a prediction, or if I had to say what would I like would like both candidates to find ways to maintain the face of the other candidate. Again, I think indirect attacks are probably better for our American political system than direct face threats because, again, it tends to increase what I would describe as the more aggressive tone, and that can become problematic for working through solutions to political problems.
Okay. Another quick question here. Can you talk about the differences that specific formats may have on politeness? For instance, some suggest that if there's a podium debate, candidates might be less polite than they are if they're seated next to one another at a table. Have you found that to be true?
No. The data, no, we had that as a research question when we did the analysis of the transcripts from 1960 through 2004. And I really thought there would be a difference. The idea that you're sitting very close to someone or standing very close to them and you're having this conversation, it's really hard to be mean to someone when you're this close, right? And with town hall formats, when you're moving in close to talk to the people, again, it's kind of hard to be really super aggressive about the other person, even if there's some physical distance between them. So I really thought that might be the case, but when we looked at the data from 1960 through 2004, we couldn't find any statistically significant relationship between format and face threat. So, but that's only what our 1960-2004 data showed.
Okay, interesting. Another question here. Can you name any specific events where direct face threats or confrontation had a positive influence on a debate outcome or a campaign? So when does a direct face threat, can you give an example of a direct face threat helping a candidate in a debate or during the campaign?
It's a research question we haven't quite answered yet. So I believe that on things like maybe moral issues, it might make some sense to have a direct face threat. Again, I'm not sure if that would work, because if it's two moral worldviews going at each other and both moral worldviews are coherent or defensible in terms of values, you're just condemning that candidate and the moral worldviews of the constituents he or she represents. So I don't know. I wanted to ask that question when we looked at some of the data in terms of timing, and that's a research question we haven't quite answered yet. That is, on campaign issues that are important to one candidate versus another, do they elevate direct face threat in response to an attack on their character, on their position? We haven't quite come back to that question yet, so I don't have the data to answer that question. I would be making things up. That's probably not good research.
You could do that. We wouldn't even know. It'd be all right. Okay. The next question here, and this is kind of a meta question. It's not directly per se related to politeness, but I think it's an interesting one. I'm interested to hear your answer. The structure of your study focuses on the debate as a singular event. Do you believe that debates are a fair representation of a candidate and how they would perform as a president or otherwise?
Yes. Well, I'm trying to think. The argument we're making is that by watching the candidates in that interaction, you can learn something about them that you can't by just seeing them give a speech on a stage by themselves, because there's not the prospect of imminent response. The idea is that if they make a bad argument, the opposing candidate's going to stand up and refute that. So they're making really, really good arguments, presumably, like the best arguments their campaign staff has been able to put together for them in the course of preparing for that debate. So seeing how they handle themselves, seeing if they miss an opportunity to be gracious to their opponent, seeing if they miss an opportunity to use indirect face threats when they didn't need to use a direct face threat. I think there's something about how audiences make sense of the debates that says to them, I'm not sure I like that person, the way they're handling these attacks. I mean, that's what we were finding in the data from the audience responses in the 2000 presidential campaign and 2004 presidential campaign. So, we've done another study we presented as a convention paper. I want to go back to this question. It might be the case that female voters make sense of the debates using politeness constructs on some issues in different ways than male voters on different issues in different ways. And we found it in 3 of 4 campaigns, and please don't press me on which campaigns those were, because I didn't load that up in coming for the presentation, but in 3 of the 4 campaigns, politeness, that is face-saving strategies, made a difference for female voters. Now that's a very important fact. I mean, if that's true, if we can get data from our respondents in the 2016 campaign, put that project together, it means that candidates have to think carefully about their face-threatening messages and their face-threatening strategies, because if female voters make decisions later in the campaign, and if female voters tend to be undecided in a campaign, and if we tune into debates as campaign events to get the most information about the candidates, and if that relationship between the candidates is very important to how a female voter makes sense of who to vote for, all of a sudden we've got a very interesting formula for figuring out how to appeal to female voters in a close campaign where debates are featured on significant issues that may be of interest to female voters. All right, so I'm trying to put those things together, but I don't have a real definitive position to offer from our research program on that right now. I can just tell you it's some work that we've done, we'd like to turn back to.
Okay. I think we have a few more minutes here. We can get through 1 or 2 more questions. Is there a correspondence or correlation between the increase in direct face threats to character and leadership competence and the success of a candidate using direct face threats? So has the increase been more successful? Is there an appeal to this?
The increase in direct face threats.
Face threats to character and leadership confidence.
I don't think the data can be analyzed in that way. I don't think we can make a claim with the data. I don't think there's. I wish I had my social scientific correspondents, collaborators with me here, because they'd answer that question specifically. I think the best you can do is to talk about indirect strategies and the correlation with potential success, and direct strategies.
Okay. Another question here. Can you give a kind of like a paradigmatic example of kind of positive politeness in a debate, as well as kind of the opposite of that, kind of the most direct face threat?
Well, off the top of my head, I would point back to maybe one of the messages that we saw here as balancing concerns for the other person. I recognize my opponent has worked very hard in supporting the issues that are of interest to them. They've obviously got a good record in their community, but I think that there are a couple of problems that you need to be aware of with their program. And then I might list those 1 or 2 or 3 problems. So in that sense, I'm recognizing that the candidate is a person who's working hard, trying to solve problems, but I'm also trying to say that I don't think that their policies will solve the problem as well as my policies or programs might. And then I might tell you why my programs might be better. Right? So there's a recognition the other person is striving to solve problems in our democracy. And I'm asking you to vote for me because I think I've got a better policy. And I'm willing to give you the evidence and the reason, I hope, if I think I've got the evidence and the reason. So again, it kind of grounds the debate, it grounds the exchange in terms of evidence and reasoning so that the audience can deliberate. The audience can try and make sense, well, which policy would make more sense for the nation or this group of people or in response to solving this particular problem. I think that's an example of a good message.
And an example of a negative one?
I think John Kerry gave us the best example. My opponent has made a colossal judgment and error. Everything they do is wrong. What we need is absolute new leadership. They're taking the country in a completely wrong direction. I mean, all those are just very direct face threats that indicate that the opposing candidate has nothing positive to contribute to the solution of our political problems.
The last question that we have today is, could you talk about the difference in the level of face threats or politeness in general election debates versus primary debates?
I don't know. The answer is no. We've not compared the aggregate scores of the data we have from the 2012 GOP debates with the aggregate scores across the campaigns from 1960 and 2012. So the answer to that question is no, but that is an interesting research question that we will be able to answer, we hope, after we finish this next cycle of data collection and analysis.
Excellent. All right, well, once again, I think we should all thank Dr. Hinck for being here. I want to thank our sponsors again and just mention that we're really appreciative for all the support. I also want to thank our volunteers who have been here helping out and remind all of you that if you're interested, we have free food. There's a reception to follow out here in the lobby area. We would love it if you would join us for that. You may have a minute or two to follow up if you have any additional questions. You wanted to speak with me or Dr. Hinck. Thank you to Dr. Henry for being here and introducing. And once again, thanks to all of you for participating in an essential component of democratic engagement, learning more about presidential debates and the process that this campus and our nation are about to participate in. Thanks for being here, everyone.